Have you ever thought why everything that exists wants to stay in existence? From a bacterium to an oak tree, from an ant to a human, all living things are trying to avoid extinction, not just to live, but to multiply, to leave a mark, to pass on a piece of yourself. Moreover, this effort is not limited to conscious beings. Unconscious organisms also behave as if they were programmed to survive and reproduce. But why? Science tells us that living things were shaped this way through evolution. Those who survived were able to pass on their genes. The others disappeared. And the species we have left today, that is, those that succeeded in this race, including us. But is this just a matter of evolution? Is the fact that life is so stubborn and so resistant to nothingness merely the result of chance and selection? Is what we call the reproductive instinct merely a game of genes, or is it a reflection of the universe's own desire to exist? In this video, we will first look at the nature of life. What does science tell us? Why is everything so focused on survival and reproduction? Then we'll step back a little and ask. We will ask why this order was established this way, and whether we are free within this order or merely tools that maintain it. The process of natural selection proposed by Darwin shows how living things reach their current diversity. The strongest species, or the ones best adapted to their environment, survive and pass on their genes, while those that cannot adapt are lost in the dusty pages of history. Richard Dawkins' selfish gene approach also supports this view. All efforts of organisms actually serve the survival of genes. Every movement of life, from the simplest bacteria to the most complex ones, even to humans, bears the traces of this invisible transmission. We can see the same internal drive in the division and reproduction of bacteria and in the effort of a person to survive. Now, let us first understand the issue scientifically. I will try to explain it as simply and clearly as possible. Every living thing makes an incredible effort to survive. Almost all of us have noticed this, right? This can actually be understood on 3 levels. The first layer is about energy. Living things are just like little engines. It takes energy from the environment, processes it, and produces heat and waste. Without this energy cycle, order would collapse and life would stop. The second layer concerns genetic information. Consider our DNA. Like a book passed down from generation to generation, the creatures that can copy this book better and preserve it without errors will survive. Moreover, this is not just an effort to save oneself. Sometimes an individual puts himself at risk to benefit his relatives. The laws of evolution show that this is one of the clever ways to ensure the continuation of genes. The third layer is collaboration and big leaps. Single cells combine to form multicellular organisms. Then communities and civilizations were established. Without this cooperation, species would quickly become extinct. In laboratory experiments, we even see that bacteria constantly develop little tricks to adapt to their environment over millions of generations. In other words, the story of life's survival is actually a result of nature favoring the side that uses energy best, transfers information most accurately, and learns to act together. Science tells us how these mechanisms work, but it can remain silent when it comes to explaining why this mechanism exists and why it persists with such force. This is exactly where we ask the question. Is this deep impulse of life simply the gene's own perpetuation, or is it part of an order created by a greater power? When we look at a plant that finds its way out of a small crack in the middle of the asphalt, many of us feel the need to search for meaning in it. A few mathematical formulas or scientific explanations are not always sufficient to explain this, because if we do not seek this meaning, there is no other living creature in our world that can do it. The fact that life continues to exist even in the most extreme conditions of the world magnifies this meaning even more. Even in the dark depths of the oceans, around volcanic vents, in boiling waters, or under deadly radiation, life finds a way. Science calls these creatures extremophiles, and their existence reveals just how resilient life can be. Even after the cataclysms that wiped out the dinosaurs, the world was filled with living things again. It was as if life wanted to re-enter the scene at every opportunity given to it. Of course, there were those who wanted to explain this stubbornness of life solely by coincidences, but there were also those who asked whether the universe contained a tendency within itself that preserved its existence. The constant re-establishment of order, the rebirth of things despite their destruction, seemed to be a law woven into the background of the universe by an unseen will. Therefore, the persistence of life could not be merely a biological mechanism. This could also be read as a signal flare for a greater truth. Philosophers have tried to understand this mystery for centuries. Aristotle said that every being moves towards its own goal, and everything, from the falling of a stone to the growth of a tree, carries its own inscription of entelechy, that is, its desire for realization. Schopenhauer argued that the real force that directs life is not reason but the deep-seated will to live. For Nietzsche, this desire was not only to continue existing but also to want more, to surpass his limits and become stronger. Although each philosophical perspective used a different language, what they pointed to was the same. There is an impulse that reveals itself in life. This impulse extends beyond the boundaries drawn by scientific explanations and leaves us with a series of questions. When we look at the universe itself, we encounter a similar picture. The laws of physics direct matter to come together and form more complex structures. Atoms combine to form molecules, and molecules combine to form cells. While the second law of thermodynamics tells us that entropy or disorder will increase, life makes the opposite move in the midst of this flow and establishes order. While explaining order, I will of course also talk about disorder. Actually, it's a bit about the time scale. When we look at the very long term, over a horizon of billions of years, the second law of thermodynamics prevails. Everything is moving towards disintegration, energy equalization, and ultimately a dark, cold universe. So in the final picture, disorder is dominant, but in the short term, the situation is completely different. Orders emerge through the windows that the universe opens within itself. The miracle of these short periods is precisely the combination of atoms to form molecules, and molecules to form cells. In fact, there was no obligation. The universe could also be a completely messy scene, where stars, planets, and life never formed. But matter seems to prefer to come together and form increasingly complex structures, guided by the laws of physics. Words like choice, programming, or willpower may be extremely disturbing to materialist perspectives, but from this perspective, order is not a short-term guest, a meaningful expression of existence. Perhaps what we call life is the most creative attempt to establish order within the universe itself. The emergence of order out of chaos suggests that there is a tendency in the universe that cannot be explained by coincidences alone. It's as if the universe has a principle of existence built into its background, and this principle makes itself felt in everything from the birth of stars to the beating of a child's heart. Therefore, the stubbornness of life appears as a reality that we encounter on a cosmic scale. When we come to humans, we encounter one of the most striking reflections of this great order. Humans are not just creatures trying to survive. At the same time, it is an entity that questions the meaning of this struggle for survival. While the efforts we make to protect ourselves from hunger and danger reflect our commonality with animals, our production of art, science, and philosophy reveals a very different layer. The first person to draw a picture on a cave wall wasn't just telling us that he was alive. He also said that life is worth leaving a mark on. The invention of writing, the founding of cities, our gazing at the stars with scientific curiosity all stem from the same deep impulse to sustain existence and give it meaning. If this drive were merely the gene's game for self-preservation, it would be an incomprehensible paradox that humans develop such complex thoughts, write about death, or investigate the origin of the universe. So our life drive extends far beyond bare biology. Science can explain how the human mind works and what evolutionary processes it has gone through. But this is insufficient to explain why the mind wants to surpass itself and why it always seeks more. At this point, the idea of a deeper order brought into being by a creator becomes almost inevitable. If all living things were merely biological machines driven by genes, it would be meaningless for humans to speak of free will. However, we do not live solely by instincts. He makes moral decisions and sacrifices. Sometimes we can behave in ways that are contrary to our own existence. A mother can put herself in danger for her child. A scientist devotes his life to reaching the unknown. An artist can endure great pain in order to leave his work to future generations. The reduction of these behaviors to a simple gene transfer strategy does not seem convincing. If there is no creation behind life, we would have to explain the meaning of this stubborn resistance only through natural laws and evolutionary processes. Isn't that right? Let's try. What did we say now? The theory of evolution shows that the basis of life is continuous elimination and selection. Those who survive pass on their genes, and the uninterrupted continuation of this transfer makes life possible. One of the examples frequently given by biologists is tardigrades, or water bears. These microscopic creatures can survive in temperatures as cold as -200 degrees, in the vacuum of space, and under high radiation. Their survival strategy is so powerful that it demonstrates how life can evolve limitless ways just to maintain its existence. Similarly, there are bacteria that have adapted to live around hydrothermal vents, kilometers deep in the ocean, where no sunlight reaches. The purpose of these organisms is simply to continue their existence, a cycle sustained solely by chemical processes, without any higher consciousness or purpose. Schopenhauer called this life itself a blind will to live. In other words, this insistence could be interpreted not as the product of a conscious design, but as the product of a blind impulse that exists at the basis of nature. Nietzsche's idea of the will to power pointed in a similar direction. Life is not content with just existing. He wants more. It wants to grow and multiply. So the meaning of life is not a purpose given from outside. It is its own internal drive, he said. When combined with scientific mechanisms, this picture tells us the following. Life is a process that carries meaning within itself. If there is no creator, what we call meaning is actually life's way of sustaining itself. The proliferation of bacteria, the reaching of trees into the sky, and the production of art by humans are all different aspects of the same cycle. In this approach, life creates its own meaning with its own persistence. The search for meaning cannot go beyond a need revealed by our consciousness, a byproduct of evolution. According to this understanding, this interpretation may be enough to convince many people, but in my opinion, these interpretations do not provide a definitive explanation for why life is so resilient, why it constantly returns despite all obstacles. Why does life find its own possibility even for short periods of time? Why are cells programmed to connect to each other in certain ways? Why is there something instead of nothing? There are no satisfactory answers to questions like these. Things that seem like answers actually tell us only this. Life exists because it is programmed to exist. When we ask why such programming exists, science says permission and leaves. Where science remains silent here is not actually its weakness, but its strength. Because science has reached its limits, because it knows it only explains what it can observe and measure. It's a unique guide in explaining how life works. But when it comes to the why question, it leaves that area to other ways of thinking. Science isn't to blame here. In other words, science shows me the way, but it's not its job to tell me where the path leads. As Morpheus said, I can only show you the door. It's you who must walk through it. That's why we need to use two different languages simultaneously when trying to understand life. The language of science answers the how question. It explains in detail how living things reproduce, how genes are passed on, how stars are born and die. But the why question still remains. Why is there such order? Why does life persist despite all the challenges? You might think that because I constantly emphasize order, I act as if there's no disorder. And I'm very aware of it. Because if the picture of the universe is painted solely with order, the picture is incomplete. Yes, the way atoms combine to form molecules, and molecules combine to form living things, provides an extraordinary sense of order. But at the same time, the explosions of stars, the collisions of planets, and the extinction of species are also inseparable parts of this picture. In fact, most of the time without this destruction we call disorder, the emergence of new orders is impossible. For example, without the chaotic explosion of a supernova, the heavy elements that make up our entire bodies would never have existed in the universe. Without the random mutations of bacteria, evolution would not have progressed, and diversity would not have emerged. We humans tend to see order as good and disorder as bad, because our minds prefer what is safe and predictable, but this perspective can mislead us. On an evolutionary scale, extinctions are relentless, but without them, there would be no room for new species to emerge. Why do we choose to call only what is beautiful and good order? Why do we exclude the chaotic and disruptive from order? Yet, couldn't everything we call disorder be part of the rhythm of a larger order? Ultimately, settling for mechanisms alone leaves the whole picture incomplete. For every mechanism to function, it must first exist, must have begun. The persistence of life, the existence of freedom, the constantly re-established order in the universe, all of these point to a source beyond the picture drawn by science. Perhaps as we continue to understand the mechanisms of science, we will also be making those mechanisms possible. We must also sense the power that makes us what we are, and we are right in the middle of this story. On the one hand, we observe and measure. On the other, we search for the meaning behind those measurements with our intuition. Humans are both the product of the universe and the living witness of this grand order, as the universe's self-questioning consciousness. The stubbornness of life, the spark of freedom, and the questioning of consciousness make me say this: I am the face of the universe trying to understand itself. So who are you in this boundless universe? Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any future videos. I'm Owl of Ages. See you in the next video.